I grew up in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, and I live with my mom and my sister. And Englewood Cliffs is like a suburb right outside New York City. As a very little kid, like in nursery school, I had a lot of friends. I was very, very extroverted, very outgoing. I think that over the years, certainly as I got a little bit older, dealing with, kids can be really mean. So I think that I've definitely closed off more, and like had more fears dealing with like new surroundings and being around new people. But as a young kid, I had tons of friends. I was very, very social. So I was born with congenital rubella. My mother, in the first trimester of pregnancy, had German measles. And the story of how she contracted it was kind of ironic. Her doctor, her OBGYN, was really good friends with my father, and they played tennis together and socialized. And the doctor's wife, went traveling, came back and contracted German measles. They all socialized. My father got very sick. And he had like a fever of 104 for over a week. He was delirious. Being my typical father, refused to go to the hospital, refused to get checked. About 10 days later, my mom found a rash on her upper chest. Other than that, she was totally fine, very few symptoms. But she suspected she had contracted the German measles and started researching, trying to figure it out because she knew that she was pregnant. And they can't test whether or not you have German measles, but they can test the titer of the baby to see if the baby's been affected. They did the test. The test read as being 112, meaning I was totally fine, unaffected. The doctor was dyslexic. The titer was really 121, which was a blessing because had they read it correctly, the advice would have been to abort me. Most rubella babies are not nearly as fortunate as I was and do not have good quality of life. Some are, but most are not. When I was born, the hospital knew the doctor was dyslexic. They were covering up for him. When I was born, it was Super Bowl Sunday. My dad, being a huge football fan, wanted to watch the game, but he didn't want to watch the game alone. He wanted to watch the game with his friend, the doctor. So I wasn't very convenient in my timing, and so I was, kind of cutting it close with the game, so they tried to induce labor. And by the time they shot the epidural, I had already started to crown, so my mom was tied up with a spinal headache for the first 2 weeks of my childhood. And so she couldn't lift me, hold me, sit up. But when she did, she noticed that one of my eyes was rolling up into the top of my head. And she was very concerned. She kept asking them to test the bilirubin, test the torch. They kept denying everything. They said the bilirubin was normal. It was really inverse. It was normal, then elevated. It should be the opposite. And, they said the torch was fine. And it wasn't until about 3 months later, my grandfather had just had cataracts. And my mother said, one eye looks a lot like my father's. And sure enough, she kept going around. She was really persistent, probably where I get it from. And so she found a doctor who confirmed that I did have cataract. They removed the cataract when I was 3 months old. And they left, it was cataract surgery back then was very different than it is now. So they left debris and they pulled the iris. So we had to go back and do a retinal cleanup. And when they did that, they found rubella pigmentation behind the sighted eye. And that's how they confirmed that I had congenital rubella. There were several complications. My growth was stunted. I was born missing 10 teeth. I had graphic motor impairment. I had heart surgery when I was about a year old. I still have scar tissue, which now in my movement practices has been something that's come up a lot. Definitely affects my thoracic mobility. It's always like a challenge that I'm working through. I was born hearing impaired. I guess you would consider it legally deaf. It's like a 75 to 80%, depends which year. One year has more clarity, the other year has more volume. But I learned how to speak by reading lips. So I didn't get hearing aids until I was almost 6. I was also born with hypotonia, which meant that the muscles didn't develop. And they also call it floppy baby syndrome. but I was very fortunate. It didn't affect my trunk. It was just my limbs. And more modern practices, they typically put children into a full body brace, which would have been horrendous for me because most of them end up in a wheelchair because their muscles atrophy. We were really lucky. I had a baby nurse who was from one of the British Islands. I don't know which one. But she said, that sounds ridiculous. Just put her in a wet sandbox, which thank goodness, but it totally worked. It helped because the sandbox had enough resistance. So it created the neuromuscular coordination, stimulation, and then because there was resistance, it triggered hypertrophy because I had to fight against the wet sand. And I was too young to do any kind of real, strength training at that point. I was an infant. So I remember the first day where it was really brought to my attention. I was, I guess like 5, 6, somewhere around there. And my mom was doing the dishes. I usually talked to her, help her while she did the dishes. And every time she turned away, I say, what? I couldn't hear her. And I had an ear infection at the time. I had chronic ear infections as a child. And that made my hearing worse whenever I had an ear infection because they're all clogged. So whatever hearing I did have was impaired further. So every time she turned away, and so finally she said to me, I think we had a neighbor who lived diagonally behind us, and she wore hearing aids. She was not nearly as significantly hearing impaired, but she wore hearing aids. So I had some association with it. And she said to me, I'm thinking maybe just for when you have an ear infection, we should look into getting a hearing aid like Bonnie. And that was her name. And I said, okay, yeah, sure. And a few weeks later, we went to the audiologist. We started doing testing. And my mom says the thing that she remembers is that as soon as we stepped outside, I kept asking her, what's that noise? What's that noise? And it was birds chirping. I had never in my life heard birds chirping. But what I remember was I walked upstairs when we got to the house. And for the first time, I heard my footsteps. Like I didn't just feel them, I heard, and I was, oh my gosh, that's so loud. It was like vibrating through me. I'm like, my footsteps. And I remember it as a kid. And I still remember, it took a while to get used to that. And I'm like, so do you hear me from upstairs? Like, that's so loud. Yeah. Really, before I was even fully walking, as an infant and as I got older, my mom used to dance with me. So I spent my mom and I were very close, obviously. We spent a lot of time together. And I think most mothers and children do. But because I was so sick, she was constantly in and out of the hospital with me and going to doctors with me, and working on ways to help find stimulus for me to strengthen whatever I did have, whatever senses were stronger. So, but she used to dance with me. And so that was just, I think, from such a young age, it was a bonding time, and it was also a connecting time. And it was a way for me to develop my kinesphere and get a sense of my own place in the world, both connecting to my body, myself, internally, and then building the kinesphere and proprioception externally and connecting to other people. And I think that started from a really early age with the dance. And then from then on, they were always doing all sorts of, we were always doing all sorts of exercises with, I had a patch over my sighted eye every other day of my childhood. And I would have to spend 2 hours a day doing eye exercises, whether it be, with this kind of stuff and, whether it be trying to read things or a lot of puzzle playing. I did a lot of that. And I actually really loved that. That was really fun. I hated light bright. I had an experience not too long ago, maybe, I don't know, a few years ago. In New York City, there's a club, a light bright club, and they had light brights. I walked in and I saw them and I started crying because I spent so much of my childhood trying to, with a patch over my eye, find the little hole and stick this thing in, make shapes out of it. It was so frustrating for me. So those are kind of, I mean, they're not movement, but they're movement oriented. They're definitely spatially oriented. And then my mom had this idea, and it was from a very young age. I think I was 2, 3 was when not long after I was walking, she had an idea to make a balance beam. And so my grandfather built this beam that was, each week we would make it narrow, or as I progressed, they made it narrower and narrower. And there's a low beam and a high beam. And every other day I'd walk on it with my patch on and without the patch so that I could develop my vestibular sense, and proprioception, and just learn to get some balance regardless of whether I could see and hear or not, because I didn't have hearing aids yet at that time. But then from there, I think that when I went to camp, they had gymnastics, and I saw the beam, and I used to play on my monkey bars, like on the swing sets, and I was always climbing, and I noticed that recently. I didn't even know that about myself until I looked through these pictures. I'm like, Mom, so I was always either climbing or balancing or posing while climbing and balancing. I'm like, nothing's changed. I feel like that's so weird. She's like, yeah, that's pretty much what you did. But when I found gymnastics, I like instantly gravitated towards it. And I think so much of it was that, one, there's this sense of like developing my kinesphere and having something that gives me a sense of orienting myself and connecting myself both to me and the world around me. When your other senses are muted, you feel like very isolated, and it's really hard to know your place. It's hard to find your balance, and not just physical balance, but also your interpersonal connection, your awareness of your surroundings, your understanding of your place. My mom said that, she says she finds it really interesting that children have so much of their personality inherent. And she said that they were always trying to give me rewards. So much of the stuff that I did was so difficult, but we had to work on it. And so they were always trying to reward me, but that for me, the reward was always in getting it. So, like if I walked across the beam and I made it to the end of the beam, like that was such a reward for me. Like I didn't need an external gratification. And I think that's part of it with movement, is that it is such a challenge, but it was so gratifying to be able to walk across the beam, to be able to hang from the bar, to dance and to feel that and not fall. So that's a huge part of it, is to have that sense of accomplishment. I think that when you're born with so many physical limitations, while I was really fortunate in that I did have people who were supportive, there were a lot of people, I mean, they told my mother to go find a nice institution for me to spend the rest of my life. Like, there was not a lot of people who were thinking there was much hope for me. And so I think to have movement is so tangible. So when you physically accomplish something, it's like, boom, like, there it is. You can't argue with it. My whole premise behind creating this show is I believe all human beings are designed to move, but the way that which they do is their unique creative expression. And I think that movement has allowed me to very much tap into my body, which is my home. We're emotional beings, we're intellectual beings, we're spiritual beings, we're also physical beings. And that's kind of where we reside, is in the physical. So I think in being able to truly inhabit that gives me the freedom to express myself and to be creative, and to find play and to find my creative expression. So the ways that has been a huge emotional relief for me, because when I'm stressed, what do I want to do? Move. When I'm depressed, what do I want to do? Move. When I'm feeling isolated, I want to move and find other people to move with. When I'm feeling stifled or stuck, movement literally like helps me to move through that. So I think emotionally it has been, there's so many times in my life where I don't know that I would have, pun intended, moved forward if I didn't have my movement outlets. Physically, it has helped me to function because I'm blind in one eye. So it's not like I don't get motion parallax. I have intellectual depth perception, but I don't have depth perception the way most people have depth perception. Most people, they see one eye straight, the other eye sees on an angle. I don't get that. So for me, it's always about sizing things up to my surroundings and my periphery. But having created a stronger kinesphere has allowed me to not walk into things. Sometimes I still do, but it's like I've developed an awareness of my body and my relationship to things around me. So it's helped me to literally function. And then there's, because I'm hearing impaired, I don't have the same natural vestibular sense that other people might have, but because I've learned to balance on things and I've learned to be, inverted, hanging from things, suspended, I developed my proprioception. Proprioception is like my understanding of where I am in space, and that literally helps me to function and navigate through the world. I mean, I think that if I didn't have all of my movement practices, driving would have been much more challenging than it is. Just driving's not that easy for me. So, but because I've developed a stronger proprioception and spatial awareness, I think that I'm able to do a lot of those things. And then there's just, I think, other things like, having a heart condition. I think if I didn't, I still have a systolic murmur. I'm very lucky it's not like an issue now, but I think that if I hadn't built up some sort of strength, both cardiovascularly, physically, I'm not sure that I would have the same resiliency that I do. I had an experience last week where I've never trained flag before. Flag is where, and I was training it on Stalder bars. Flag is an exercise where one arm is kind of pulling and the other arm is pushing, and you look like a human flag. So you're ideally in a horizontal position. I tried training that for the first time last week, and I was training it on this side, I guess the right side up, and it was definitely difficult. But once I had some people working with me, explaining it to me, and I was able to go from candlestick, where you're in a vertical, start to low down, and I was managing. It was a physically challenging, and it's a learning the skill, but I was starting to get it. I went to the other side. I'm like, oh, I should try the other side because this is actually my stronger arm, so maybe that'll work better. So I switched. They advised me to bring one knee in because that's easier. You're shortening your lever. And I did that and immediately started to panic because my knee started to block my vision. And I'm upside down and I'm freaking out. I don't know if I have the strength to hold myself. I mean, just even trying flag, I didn't know if I could do it, And I just totally panicked, and I came down and full on sobbing. It was like a true trauma response. I didn't know if it wasn't like tears. It was just I was so panicked and so shaken up. And then I was really embarrassed. There were a lot of people around, and I'm crying because I'm training flag, and I'm like, what? But I decided I wanted to do it again because I didn't want it to become a traumatic experience. And I wanted to work through it, both emotionally and physically. I wanted to figure out how I could start training the muscles so I could learn it, but also to emotionally work through the process. And so I instinctively this time went and had both legs straight, which I was told is much harder, but for me, I was so much more calm and stable because I could see where I was. And I was able to start to work the, negative and start working through it. But yeah, my mom said to me, she's like, so you were so terrified and then you went and did it again? And I was like, and, she was really supportive, but I was like, yeah, because I don't know. That's something that I feel like, because I've had to overcome so much, that I don't want fear to be, I think I get scared all the time, but I don't want fear to be what stops me. I need to trust both my physical strength and my emotional strength more, because I have a really good sense of when it's not safe and I know to bail, right? I'm not going to put myself in a dangerous position. But I think so often there's so little in life that can be accomplished if we just, let fear stop us. And I think that for me, having spent so much of my life being told, you can't do this, you can't do this. And there's just so many things nobody expected me to be able to do. And I do have a bit of, I'm not rebellious in most ways, but in that way I kind of am. Like if you tell me I'm not going to be able to do something, like I'm going to figure out how I'm going to do it. Having been visually and hearing impaired and spent pretty much every other day of my childhood blind and deaf, that's really isolating. So my biggest fear is isolation. And I am very much a social person. Like I have a very deep, strong need to connect with other people. Um, and so I don't want to be isolated, but then I'm also terrified of abandonment and rejection and all those things. So it's a big paradox. But yeah, so acro is an environment where I do love to move, and I am very connected to my kinesthetic sense. So it's a huge way of me connecting to somebody else. So it is this strange combination of, yes, it's terrifying for me, and I'm constantly battling that. But it's also incredibly rewarding to be able to connect with somebody. I mean, there is verbal communication as well, but there's such a deep nonverbal communication that happens with that. And for me, in some ways, it's scary, but it's also incredibly intimate, which is really rewarding because you're connecting with somebody so deeply. And I do love the challenge of working on building that trust, because as scary as it is for me, and oftentimes I'm not very good at it and it takes me a while, it's also just it's a really beautiful experience to find that you can trust somebody else, and that somebody else will be there for you, and that somebody else can help you. Because I think that that's like, especially for someone like me, so much of my life, like I've had to be resilient, I've had to be self-reliant, I've had to um, overcome a lot on my own, I've had to depend on myself. Um, and not always because there wasn't somebody there. A lot of times there were, but there's just so much that I struggled with that's unique, and that's it's my own experience. And so for me to then trust that somebody else is going to be there to catch me, somebody else is going to be there to support me, because the reality is in life, whatever you can do alone, you can do so much better with other people. There is strength in numbers, and so if you are to let somebody help you, you're going to go that much further. Then it's like two great minds together, as opposed to one great mind may do great things, right? But like if you have two combined, and then if you have 10 combined, the amount that can be achieved is that much greater. So I really want to explore what is movement to other people. And I've called it movement as opposed to exercise or athletic performance, or because I wanted to encompass a very wide scope of performance artists, movement artists, athletes, athletes with disabilities and challenges. But I really wanted to be how people move and what it's meant to them. As an actor, one of the things that you study is people's like physical patterns. That's how you build a character, right? And I know that for me, like I've always, because nonverbal communication has been such a huge part of how I communicate with people, I very much recognize people's posture, the way they move their bodies, the way that they walk, the way they jump, the way they explore things. So much of that is their physical being, and it's their unique creative expression. That's how they express themselves. So I want people to explore movement patterns that resonate for them, things that give them joy, things that empower them. Like, not to say that you should never work on your weaknesses. I mean, athletes always need to, balance things out, and for performance, you need to work on things that you may not love to do. But I think that in general, movement is so empowering. I always say that, like, I like to do my strength stuff so that I can go play. I want to know that when I get onto an apparatus that I'm safe and that I can explore and create, because I've built the strength to do that. So for me, that's really what it's about. It's about somebody finding out what it is like to inhabit their body and truly be in their body, not think about like, what exercise am I doing? How am I doing this? What results am I going to get? Because the thing about movement is that it's very tangible. So much of life, and I feel like so much of my life has been, you may be progressing, but you can't see it. And it's very kind of like this intangible kind of, it's not quantifiable, and it's not linear. It's like you may take 2 steps forward, then you take a step back, and then, you have this experience here, or you accomplish this thing here, and you don't know how it fits into the bigger puzzle. But with movement, like if I set a very simple goal of I can do 10 push ups and I want to be able to do 11, I may not get it tomorrow, but I know that if I keep working towards it, I will make progress. And there's something incredibly empowering about that. So it's so funny. When I first moved out to LA, I didn't know anybody. And then 5 weeks after me, my trainer from New York moved out here. So of course I worked with him, even though it was like really inconvenient, really far away, and probably not fiscally prudent at all. But I continued to work with him because I knew him, and I was like, okay. So I remember I was really struggling. I mean, I didn't know anybody. I was, the entertainment industry is probably not the best place to find your feet, but I remember saying to him that I was like, I need to find a hobby because I need to find something really like simple that I can take on and where I can master it. I can become good at it. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, I just need to do this for my self-esteem because I'm really sucking at life right now. And it's really making me miserable because I feel like a big failure. And he said, well, with all due respect, like, isn't this it? And I was like, what do you mean? I was like, I'm talking about something I'm good at. I want something like, I walk in and like, I know I can do this. And then I feel good about myself when I leave. And he's like, well, you're better than like 99% of people who walk in here. And I was like, that's not true. And I was like, besides, how do I know that? I'm not watching them. Like I've always been a self-competitor. So there's always, no matter what goals I set for myself, I always feel very far away from them. And I just feel like I've fallen short because I haven't reached them. So I'm always like, I need to do this, I need to do this, and I'm not there yet. But then there's also this, like, you can't help but compare yourself to the people around you, right? And I am surrounded by people who are pretty awesome, and they can do amazing things and they look amazing doing them. So on top of this feeling of like the pressure I put on myself, there's also that like social anxiety of like, well, are they gonna want me to be in their space? Because like I always feel like, well, I'm not really that good, so do they really want me to be like training with them or playing with them, or am I going to hold them back? Or before I go, I have to kind of talk myself into it. And that's ongoing. It's just a battle with me. And I have to remind myself that, and some days I will say, you know what, I'm not going to because I'm feeling raw, I'm feeling vulnerable, and this isn't the day to put myself in that kind of situation. And I don't want to. And I've had to kind of give myself that permission too, because I think that I tend to really push on many levels. And I think sometimes that's not always productive. And I've had to work on myself with that challenge as well, knowing my own boundaries and knowing what's productive for me, and knowing that, even physically, like not every day has to be a super high intensity train for 6 hour day. Like some days maybe I'll pull it back a bit, and finding that balance is something I'm always working on. So I think we often we undermine where we're at. But there's also, it's a journey, it's a process. So I really want to encourage people to find what they're excited about doing. Find something that seems like an intangible goal, and figure out how you can get there. Start working on progressions. I don't think people should like start out seeing something that's Olympic level material and they can't do a push-up and say, I want to do that today. But, set really high goals and then see what's involved in the progressions to get there. And you'll find that even those progressions are so empowering and they feel so good. Like, I think there's just something that feels so good about being in your body and figuring out what it can do and being able to play and explore that. I, for one, am incredibly excited about exploring what is movement and what is movement to other people. So I hope that all of you are going to be excited about joining me on this journey and discovering what movement means to other people, what it does for other people, how it helps them in their lives, and how how it heals them, how it inspires them, and hopefully it'll inspire you too.